Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Unlicensed. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Jill. I'm the host of Unlicensed, and this is the podcast where women write in anonymously about any topic that they want. If that's workplace anxiety, your partner is getting on your nerves and you need to know how to communicate with them, love languages, literally spirit guides. We literally cover everything here. It does not matter. So anything on your mind that you just want to vent, get out and get some free advice from, we are joined by female guests each week, relationship coaches, therapists, friends, family, and social media influencers to help offer some advice on those topics. As you guys know, we are joined by these special guests in our season 4. We are filming at Atlanta Basement Studio. So if you guys are an Atlanta podcaster, creative, feel free to check it out. But today we are joined by Brooke Owens. She is a pastoral counselor who focuses on relationships, sex, and religious trauma. She primarily works with people and couples struggling with attachment-based anxieties, as well as queer and non-monogamy exploration as well. She has a really cool social media presence. I will allow her to plug that at the end of the episode. But welcome, Brooke. I'm so excited to have you here.
I'm so excited to be here.
It's good, guys. I've been literally stalking her on social media for months. So I'm so excited she's here. As you guys know, we like to learn a little more about our guests before we dive into the topic that we'll tell you guys in a few moments. But for you, obviously, you're a pastoral counselor, but you don't necessarily practice faith-based counseling. I want to talk about that, your deconstruction of that in your life as well, and what made you not want to go in the direction of practicing faith-based counseling too.
Yeah. So it was definitely a complicated journey because I went to school with the full intention of doing faith-based Christian counseling.
Yep.
That's what my degree is technically in, is in pastoral counseling. But during school, I had my own kind of like crisis of faith.
Yeah.
I was going through my own personal like issues and events. And I had this point during school, literally, where I was like sitting in a lecture and I was just like, I don't think I believe this anymore.
Yeah.
And so I had to sort of pivot the way I was going to do counseling, the way I'd been instructed to do counseling from that point forward, because it didn't feel authentic to really who I was at that point. And so I worked for a Christian group counseling practice the first year outside of school, just to get some experience and see maybe if there was a way for me to integrate what I'd been learning with like who I was. And I just like kept coming up against the same points, kind of like ethics, where I was just like, I don't believe like in the Christian worldview in this strict sense anymore. Yeah. And I can't counsel people as if I believe this, because if your therapist or counselor can't be authentic with you, it's really hard to build trust in the therapy space. Yes. And then it makes all the other work you do kind of muted. It's really hard to have kind of powerful therapy experiences if I feel like I'm lying to you, like in a sense.
I don't
honestly.
believe this, but I'm telling you all these things.
Right. Yeah. And so that's sort of what ended up happening in a way that it felt sort of essential that I start my own practice. Yeah. And so I did. I ended up starting almost 2 years ago my own practice, where I kind of say I'm a pastoral counselor that doesn't do faith-based counseling. Yeah. So I have really intimate personal and clinical knowledge of like the Christian world and all it can do and all of its like goodness and not so goodness and how it can impact people. And now that's almost the majority of my clients I see is people who are either questioning their faith and trying to figure out if they can hold on to parts of it and keep moving forward in other ways, or if they're like letting go of it entirely and dealing with like the loss and grief that comes with like losing your family and losing your like worldview that maybe you've grown up with, or exploring your sexuality and that not being compatible with some of the beliefs in Christianity. And now I really love it. I feel like I'm in this like nice middle spot where I get it as a former Christian. And I really like helping people kind of navigate their own way to express and view their faith if they want to.
And that's something that they want to do. That's amazing. And it's so cool that you discovered that for yourself and went on that journey, because I feel like a lot of people, especially a lot of Christians that were grown in that environment, would have just pushed through, not saying lying to your clients every week, but might have had this existential crisis of, should I just keep going forward with this because it's something I've been taught my whole life? Yeah. When you had that moment in class that you were like, I don't know if I believe this, was it something specifically that was said? Is this something you've been feeling for a while and you just confirmed it after having that class for the whole time? And then did you take quick action afterwards, or were you kind of settling for a little bit, thinking about it, and then you took action after time? What did that look like too?
Yeah. A lot of the stuff that kind of led into me questioning my own faith was related to how I view relationships. So I used to be married.
Yeah.
I was married to a man. I got divorced. There was a whole bunch of stuff that happened with that. And that really kind of like threw me through a tailspin, thinking like I did everything right. And I thought I was supposed to be like married and have this happy ever after, etc. So that was really challenging to me. And then a lot of the stuff we would talk about in class was really openly homophobic, like really, really homophobic.
Yeah.
And I wasn't out at the time, but I had just had this feeling for a long time internally of like, there's like something there. And I wouldn't admit it.
Yeah.
But I did like the classic thing that now I hear a lot with like women that come out later in life where they're just like, okay, but women are like obviously more beautiful. And like clearly, like of course you'd be attracted to like people like to women, like more like things where it's like, girl, you're queer. Right. But like that kept coming up against that in class where the program I went through was not affirming of anyone's like gay or queer exploration. It was framed as a sin. And even before I was out, I already had issues with that kind of framework in the church, but I didn't have the language for why it bothered me so much. And then once I kind of admitted to myself, I was like, oh, babe, you're bi. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
I just felt like there was no way I could like morally keep in line with that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
And it's still pretty tense within the Christian church of like, if you can be Christian and gay, there are plenty of churches and people that believe that and that support that and that are like kind of like migrating into the field of church and trying to make it okay. But most of the churches that I had grown up in never would have affirmed that. And they didn't in my program either. So they kind of treated it as if it was something to like work through.
Wow.
And not something that's like, okay, we're embracing this part of who you are. So that was the biggest kicker. And I didn't immediately, when I had this realization, like come out to everyone. I just had like a very strong knowing at that point where I was like, okay, I'm never going to practice counseling like that. I will never, ever approach a client like this. Right. So even when I went into the Christian kind of group practice, there was a nice like separation of faith and counseling. Like they didn't want faith to come up unless it came up from the client, right? Like we weren't preaching at clients in therapy. That would be pretty unethical. But it still just kept coming up in like staff meetings, right? And like I could
like behind the scenes of things.
Yes, like the culture of the group practice was just like, we're just not aligned in our worldviews. And so there was a whole journey of me like coming out to my partner and to my friends around me. And I think at that point, I just really wanted to fully embrace like who I was and that this was a part of me and I wanted to be loud about it. So that's sort of what it looked like. It's been very gradual. But now it's like a really integral part of the work that I do. I work with tons of queer people like exploring or curious and they're working through like religious shame and like but that's like my bread and butter because I like know it so well.
You can
like,
actually relate to people that like have gone through that if they're like grew up in a very religious environment where it's taught that that's a sin. I'm loving that you're able to relate to that and tell them that it's not so that they understand where you're coming from, but also can go on that self-discovery journey for themselves if that's something that they want over time as well.
Yes.
I can't imagine an environment like that, especially like the behind the scenes of everything. And, you know, to your clients, you guys are teaching like inclusivity and all of these things. And the behind the scenes, you're hearing things that are not that. And it just feels very hypocritical in that moment too.
Yeah. Like I know that if that's what you believe as a counselor, you're having to like really, really put your personal beliefs over here, which is fine. That's what you're required to do as a counselor because that happens in other areas too, where it's like, I'm a human in the room with you. I'll have an opinion about what you're doing, but it doesn't matter. That's not what's important in therapy. But that was just like too big of a piece of me to where I was like, I can't, if somebody comes to me struggling with their sexuality, I can't approach them with the worldview that it's wrong. I just can't.
No.
I can't do that.
It would be like a betrayal to yourself at that point too, I feel.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I'd been doing for like my entire life. And so I was just like, I can't professionally continue this
lie
facade.
to you guys. It's not happening.
Can't do it.
No,
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that too. And for you just getting into counseling in general, because I did a little LinkedIn sleuthing, which I love my little stalking. Seems like you had a theater background. Is that correct?
Yes.
Am I making that up? Like you graduated with your bachelor's in theater. So when did this passion and love for, therapy, counseling, when did this happen for you? Is it something that you've always known your whole life that you wanted to do it, but it was kind of on the back burner? And then after time, you're like, wait, I think that I really want to help other people with this through, especially with going through your own therapeutic journey, whatever that looks like too. When did you make that transition from like theater to now like counseling? I'm so interested to hear about this.
Sleuthing.
Girl, I love a LinkedIn sleuth. Are you kidding me? Yes.
You did that research. Okay. Yes. Yeah. So I was an actor like all through my 20s. That's what I went to undergrad for. And what I'll say is that I feel like they are actually related in a lot of ways, just because the center through line for me is I love studying human beings. Like I find like what we do and the choices we make and how we think and our frameworks for the world so fascinating.
Yes.
And I find it really fascinating to explore other people's frameworks and like thoughts and beliefs, which is kind of what exploring a character is like.
Never thought about it like that, comparing the two, but yes.
Yeah. So that was always my favorite part of acting and being in theater. I worked all around Atlanta in the theater scene.
Okay.
I did film and TV. And that was always the best part. It was like, okay, who is this person?
Yes.
Like, how do I discover them?
Yeah.
And that's kind of the exact mindset I come into the therapy space with. It's like, who is this person? How do I discover them? How do I give them enough space to have them discover themselves if they need that? Like, I don't want to put any limitations or boxes around this person. I want it to be like a very free and open space for them.
Yeah.
And that like kind of like curiosity and like discover process is my favorite part of therapy. So honestly, a lot of it came from, it was around like 2020 when I was back in school, simply because COVID was happening.
I gotta get something done.
Theater, I mean, was gone for years, like because nobody could meet and rehearse in person.
Yeah, no one's coming to shows. Like,
no one's coming to shows.
Happen.
Yeah, like I mean, even film and TV stalled for a long time.
Yeah.
So there was no work.
Yeah,
and I feel like a lot of it happened because I was reading a bunch of books by therapists and counselors I really respected because I was going through my own divorce and crisis, right? And so I felt like this draw to that kind of space where I was like, that feels like the ultimate kind of character exploration of other people. Yeah. And it just sort of naturally happened in that way where it felt very like seamless for me of like, this is fascinating. Like to learn about like the psychology of people and how like where we grow up and how we grow up affects us and the choices we make. And it felt sort of like a natural path for me.
Yes.
And acting picked up again, like once we were post-COVID. But at that point, I was deep into school and I was really invested in like the therapeutic process. Yeah. And so it's sort of taken over in that way.
Got it.
So yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That's a little bit of the journey.
No, it's so cool. Do you feel like if COVID didn't happen and the theater world and film and TV weren't put on a pause, do you feel like you would be in the position that you are now? Or do you feel like you would still be in that world? Maybe eventually getting to the point that you're now. But I always find that season of life so interesting because so many people discover things that they love about themselves within relationships, within hobbies, career, that they never would have if they didn't have that literally all fucking day to sit in your room and be like, I don't know if I like these things
There's
or not.
nothing else to focus
There's literally
on.
nothing else to do, dude. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a good question. I feel like it would have eventually happened. Yeah. Maybe at a much later point. I think COVID for a lot of people just like sped everything up that was going to happen anyways. Yeah. Like we talk about that a lot in like relationship therapy where COVID like brought people together super fast because they needed to like quarantine together, right? But it also sped up a lot of people's breakups and divorces. And it was just like a catalyst for everything. So I feel like it would have happened already because I was sort of craving a change in some kind of way. And if you've ever been in any sort of like fine arts, creative environment,
Mm-hmm.
it's very unstable. It's very unstable in terms
I worked
of
in
like,
a theater for a year and I was like,
yeah.
this is a different level of craziness that I would
Yes.
never have experienced. So
yeah, if you're doing
yeah.
anything that's like project based,
Yeah.
you're just, or gig based, you're just
Mhm.
waiting for the next gig. Like
Yeah.
you're working, you love it. And then you're like, oh, okay.
On a pause period for quite a little bit of time, guys.
And that can just be, for me, it was getting like really exhausting,
Yeah.
that process. Some people love it. I loved it in my early and
Yeah.
mid 20s. But you start approaching your 30s, you get into your 30s and you're like,
Mhm.
I'm tired.
Yeah.
I'm like so tired.
I'm trying to like invest in my future and it's hard to do that if I'm not working for like
if you
months
can't
on hand. Yeah.
open a savings account because
Yeah.
you're just living. I mean, that's the reality,
Yeah.
right? It's like you're living paycheck to paycheck often. And so
Yeah.
that's that's such a next level of exhaustion too for people. So I think this would have happened at some point or another.
100%. More of like some stability there with what you're doing now. Okay.
Yeah. And I feel much more autonomous over it, especially since it's my company.
Yes.
Because again, I mean, you can do your own projects and direct your own things and write your own like screenplays and stuff, but you're always beholden to other people in terms of like, you need an audience.
Yep.
You need investors. You have to have space to practice, rehearse, do these things, right? So you are almost always kind of like reliant on somebody else, which is fine.
Yeah.
But it slowed a lot of the like momentum that I'd want to have in that way.
Yeah.
And so I like that I can just like take it and it's mine and it's what happens with it is like up to me in a way.
Like your own independent factor with that.
Yeah.
With you starting your own company, what have you learned about yourself from like an entrepreneurial like standpoint too, or just starting your own business company project is always very scary because there's so much investment in it. And obviously you're doing it right now. And so what have you learned about yourself either on the business end or just personal development from building this thing that's your own? Because that is a different level, especially within like counseling world. Like that's a big deal. A lot of people don't have their own private practices, companies, whatever that looks like, virtual therapy practices for a very long time. So what does that look like for you and building that for yourself?
Yeah. Oh my God. I'm not good at the like structured, like let's make a budget. Let's look at numbers. Let's get the accountant involved. Like
the Excel part of it.
No, the Excel spreadsheet. It's just not my strength in any capacity. And I have like zero interest in making it my strength.
No,
so
fair. It's totally fair.
I think one of the big things I've learned is that I love to outsource the things that I'm not interested in learning how to do.
Oh, yeah.
And that there are people who are just way better at it than I'll ever
and actually
be.
enjoy it too.
Right.
Yeah.
I would like, that's been a big business sort of like learning curve for me. Is like, oh, do you want to spend the money to like hire this kind of person or have someone do this for you?
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, using like discernment, but in the most cases, I'm like, I would rather do that because if you own a business, you're already kind of playing 17 different roles.
Yes.
So if you could relieve some of those roles off your plate and you have the resources to like give it to somebody else who's going to be better at it than you. Like, let's just be honest. They're going to be better at it.
They get a high. They make the little Excel with the color coding and they're on a high. I'm like, I would rather like eat rocks. I don't want to do that.
They're calculating Excel formulas that I could never know in my dreams.
How did you guys learn how to do this?
I don't know how they did it. And I'm so impressed that they do. And I will gladly pay them for it.
Like, delegate it out.
I love to delegate.
Yes.
That's been the biggest like practical learning curve. It's just like, you just
you take it over.
And it's fine. Like you're good. You can take this. Yeah. The other thing too is on a more personal level is just the imposter syndrome is like so real I think when you own any kind of business, when people are like paying you for a service or paying for a product you have or whatever it is. For me, I've just like every month that I kept working in the business, I was like, when are people going to discover that? I'm like just Brooke. Like I'm just a girl. Like when are
just a girl.
When are people gonna discover and like never want to work with me again?
Stop.
That's what it feels like. But again, you kind of just have to like take that with a grain of salt and use the evidence of like, well, people are coming.
Yes.
Right. Like they're
people
returning.
Are staying. Yes.
Right. To kind of talk to that part of yourself. So those are probably the two biggest things that come up repeatedly for me is like, okay, don't want to do this, delegate.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, immediately.
Or Oh my God. I feel like an imposter doing this.
We can get through it though.
Yeah. Like there's no boss to go to. Like it's me.
Yeah.
I can't be like upset or mad at anyone else. Like it's me,
this
girl.
This is my business. Okay.
You did this
yes.
to yourself.
Lock in.
Yeah.
Lock in. HR meetings with myself. Okay.
Honestly, like why are there so many clients on this day? You did that.
You did this to yourself.
You did that.
It's fine. Well, what you're doing is amazing. I mean, I think you are an amazing role model for people that are out there that want to begin something. It's so easy to think exactly what you just said. Like, why would people come to me? Are they going to stay with me? Like, are they going to realize that they can find someone better? But at the end of the day, it's like, you obviously have a passion for this. You have made it happen and people are coming to you and staying with you. Like that is a testament to all the amazing stuff that you're doing. So
that's very sweet.
Keep at it. I'm excited. You're going to plug everything for you guys to follow Brooke and get all of her company information at the end of the episode. But I feel like that is a perfect segue into our advice for today, guys. Today, we are talking about setting boundaries, how to set a healthy boundary, how to distance yourself from individuals who may be overstepping your boundaries as well. So this person wrote in and they said, I have this friend I feel like I can never say no to. I've seen other people turn them down if they can't make plans or if they don't want to go out drinking on school nights. And my friend gets really mad or angry. So I've been saying yes to everything they want, even if it means going out on school nights, which is messing with my grades. They also expect me to hang out all the time, and I feel like I don't have much time for myself. How do I set boundaries with this friend and with people in general? I've always been a people pleaser, so this isn't the first time I've struggled with this. Any advice would be great. For someone, a fellow people pleaser, I say this in all my episodes, who probably has struggled with setting boundaries up until a couple years ago. I totally relate to this. So we're going to hop into it.
Yeah.
I first want to start off with something that I learned actually in my first season of filming. I had a relationship coach come on and we slowly got into this theme of setting boundaries, even though that's what we weren't really covering on the episode. And she said that setting boundaries is for yourself. It's not actually for the other person.
Yes.
Let's talk about this because I've always been someone that felt like setting a boundary is for the other person. But at the end of the day, you can't control other people's behavior. So let's talk about how setting a boundary is actually for yourself and meant to help yourself in those situations.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite topics with boundaries because there's a big, I think, more like cultural misunderstanding of what boundaries are.
Yeah.
Where they get them confused with what I would call a rule or a request to somebody else, which those are things that are valid and needed in some cases. But the boundary is always going to be behavior that is controllable by you, which means it's going to be something either you will or won't do or a way you will or won't respond to something. It has nothing to do with what the other person is going to do. It's not mandating what they can or can't do.
Yes.
That's a rule. When you tell someone, you can't talk to me this way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can put that out there as the rule and like maybe they'll follow it. But usually if you're having to set a lot of rules with people, those aren't the people that are going to be like, okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
To the
right
rule
on board. Yeah.
you're setting. Right.
Yeah.
And it also gives all the power to the other person to basically say yes or no.
That's so true.
To it. And then you'll kind of continue to feel disempowered.
Yes.
Right. Because you'll be like, well, I asked you not to.
Yeah.
And you didn't.
You keep doing it.
Which you're allowed to have feelings about that. That's a lot. But the boundary is really great because it's fully in your control.
Yeah.
And you also have to be really in tune with how you're emotionally responding to things. You have to be able to sense and validate your own emotional experiences to know where you need to put boundaries.
Yeah.
So it's really all about you in those ways. It's nothing to do with the other person.
Wow.
The boundary is responsive to the other person, or it can be proactive too, which actually those are my preferred boundaries, is getting ahead of things as opposed to reacting in the moment. But it really is nothing to do with the other person at all. And we can talk about a request too. A request is different from a rule.
Yes.
Where the rule is like you can or can't do something to me. But again, not enforceable in any way.
Yeah.
The request is I'm in relationship with you in whatever form, and I'm telling you something impacts me in a certain way, and I'm asking if you'll consider maybe doing something different, or I'm asking you to consider speaking to me about it in a different way, or I'm requesting we take more time or more focus or whatever it is to the benefit of our relationship.
Yes.
And the requests are really pivotal to make in a relationship, and they're sort of like this way to kind of have the togetherness aspect, because a boundary can feel more like, this is what I'm going to do. You do whatever you're going to do.
Yeah.
I'm going to do what I do.
Yeah.
The request kind of honors we're interdependent on each other, right? Like, yes, we are two separate things, two separate people.
Yeah.
But if we're in relationship in any way, there's a we aspect.
Yes.
And we're not going to act like that's not there and that we don't impact each other.
Love that.
Because sometimes that can occur if we get too caught up into the hyper independent, like I'm setting a boundary.
Yes, just do it. Yeah.
You won't impact me. I can't have you, right?
Yeah.
And it's not a really authentic place to live for a relationship, because we have to admit, of course what you do affects me.
Yes.
Of course what you say bothers me.
Exactly.
It's not just, okay, I won't put up with this. I'm leaving. I mean, that can be a nice action to take, but we also have to partner that with, okay, moving forward in the relationship, do you want the boundary to be every time they start doing this thing or saying this thing, you just leave? It could be an option, but how do we build relationship? How do we get into solving conflict better? How do we get to the repair that's so necessary after conflict? And a lot of times that comes through requests too.
I love that you brought up this idea of the request aspect, because I was going to say, I had this guest on my podcast who said there's like 3 different layers to a boundary. She said a statement. A lot of people will usually do a statement. So like, I don't like the way that you're talking to me. And then a lot of people will do a suggestion like, please don't talk to me like that. And then a boundary is like, hey, you're talking to me crazy. I'm going to like remove myself from the situation. And your personal experience, how has that looked like for you over time? Have you always been someone that's been able to set a healthy boundary based on what you just said in, you know, the first section of this conversation? Or were you someone that was setting a statement or a suggestion? Or have you always just been like, I know how to set a fucking boundary?
Oh my God.
What does that look like for you? Because I realized after speaking with her and you just now, I think I've always been someone kind of to say, with my family, especially more of statements, like, I do not like the way you're speaking to me right now. And then I'm a little bit avoidant. So I might just leave the conversation, which can be a little toxic and not necessarily healthy if you're trying to have a conversation with someone about how you're feeling. Really interested to see how that's looked like for you too.
Yeah. So no, I definitely have not always known how to set boundaries. And even now, I think they're a continuous learning curve of how to do it. And they're so specialized and unique to each relationship too. Like boundaries are not like this one size fits all for an issue. So my struggle was definitely on the more people pleasing side. Like even with what was written in the advice segment, I really would struggle to say no. To events, to friends, to commitments, specifically, because I would just have this immense fear of like falling behind. Or they won't ask me again if I say no.
Like the rejection of it.
Yes, the rejection and thinking like, oh my God, like I'll be alone, or I won't move forward, or I won't succeed if I don't say yes to everything. And I feel like what I had to learn too was really that first step that we're talking about, which was like, I have to get in touch with actually how this is impacting me. Because if you're more avoidant with your own feelings, you're not going to be able to fine tune some of those boundaries because you're not really actually engaged with how these potentially boundary crossing behaviors are impacting you. Because we're looking at, again, not one size fits all. We're looking at intensity too. Like things that can feel a little off, right? Or like, didn't love that, right? But it's within my kind of window of tolerance is what I call it, right? Where it's like, I'm bothered by that, but I'm okay. This is like well within my means to like take a few breaths, take a couple seconds of space and like come back and be okay, right? Like I'm not like through the roof feeling super anxious or upset, whatever, right? Those are kind of on that more mild end of the spectrum, right? But you have to be able to kind of clock how you're feeling towards things, right? And really say, how does this impact me to continuously say yes to a friend that I actually don't want to be there, like over and over and over
Sorry, guys,
again.
I cannot do this for the 5th weekend in a row.
Yeah, like how does this actually deplete me energy-wise? What do I need to replenish in those moments, right? And that's kind of what helps, I think, for me set the boundaries is what am I actually like craving, needing? What's the emotion or the want that I'm ignoring of myself? And is there a way for me, again, to make a request to the person? And then depending on how they respond to the request, do I need to put in a more firm boundary, right? Like boundary setting can be really gradual too. Love that. A lot of the time you're setting something and then you're seeing how the person responds.
Yeah.
Right?
Are they going to like respect that? Or are they going to cross over or try to test with it a little bit?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yes.
Definitely. With that, what do you feel like it says about if you have a friendship where you are trying to set a boundary with someone or even requesting, and they are just disrespecting that, whatever it looks like? If that's them first, oh yeah, I can do that. And then they're still doing the same thing. Have you ever had a friendship where you've tried to set a boundary or a request of something with their behavior that makes you feel a certain level of discomfort and they keep going for it and keep doing it? What does that look like for you specifically? And how can people learn to have enough, I guess, self-worth in themselves to maybe realize that that's not a good friendship and maybe that they need to remove themselves from that situation? Because if you have a friend that keeps disrespecting the things that you say you need to feel safe in that environment, and we'll get into how some people might use boundaries in a manipulative way as well. I'm super excited to talk about that. But for people coming in with good intentions and setting healthy boundaries and someone's disrespecting that, have you ever had a situation with someone that kept overstepping boundaries, and how did you remove yourself from that situation?
Yeah. So I don't want to say specifically who the person is, but there is a person in my life that I don't have the option to say, okay, I don't want to see you anymore. And that happens a lot. There's tons of relationships in people's lives where you can't go to, I think, what people think of the boundary, which is like, okay, you're kind of like cut off. Like I'm just like distancing.
Yeah.
So again, you have to think creatively and be really in tune with how you're responding and feeling. So this person in my life in particular, a lot of it comes around religious topics.
Okay.
And they're still like a really strong Christian and I'm not anymore. And I'm fine to have conversations about our differences, but the times in the past we've had them, they kind of go left.
Got it.
And there's nothing really like connective about the conversations anymore. They kind of just become debates.
Arguments.
Yeah, where it's like, there's no love occurring in this moment. I know we love each other, but love is not being kind of supported in these conversations. So I had set a boundary for myself and told this person, hey, I'm just not going to bring up like my religious thoughts or spiritual kind of conversations around you. Because right now I feel like we don't have the resources to have a good conversation about it.
No middle ground with it. Yeah.
No. And the way that I like to think about boundaries is boundaries are not just about the bad behaviors and interactions that you want to avoid. They're also about preserving love in the relationship.
I love that.
So you like want you want your boundaries also to protect what you love most about your relationships with this person, which goes hand in hand with I want to minimize all the interactions that minimize those feelings of love and care, right? Where like resentment and frustration and bitterness come up over and over again. That counteracts love, which is why you need boundaries there. So yeah, so that's how I try to think of it is if this is a person, which in my example it is, this is a person I want to keep in my life and have a relationship with. It's not an option for me to go, I don't want to see you anymore. I don't want to be with you or be around you. I've had to frame my boundaries around what supports feelings of love with this person. So what do I still enjoy about this person? It helps me think about this person specifically who sometimes still brings up religious topics, right? And we'll still talk about faith-based things, even though I've told her personally, I'm not going to engage in those conversations. What I have to do is sort of think about the parts of this person that I still really love and I enjoy being around. And I try to redirect us towards those kind of conversations, those kind of moments. So if they bring up religious topics and I'm like, oh, my boundary for myself was I'm not going to talk about these things. Right.
So what movie are you watching this weekend? Like, let's get into something else.
Right. So again, I try to keep the boundary as love inspiring and protective as possible. So again, I listen to them. I ask them questions if I feel like I have the capacity to, which again goes back to the like, okay, where am I? How am I feeling today? What's my capacity for this today? Because it varies. Like some days I'm like, sure, I can ask you a few questions and talk a little bit about this. And then other days with other topics, I'm like, I just can't. There's no point in doing this. Right. So that's really important. But overall, the kind of general framework I keep in mind with people who kind of continue to cross the boundaries is how do I preserve the parts of the relationship I still like? And then of course the question would be is, well, are there any parts of the relationship that you like? And it might be no. Honestly, there's nothing life-giving in this relationship for me. which at that point we can talk about what it would look like to kind of slowly distance ourselves from that person, or really have intentional time that's more spaced out with this person, or have more protective context for we meet in public versus private, etc.
Love that.
But in general, most people I talk to who are struggling with boundaries, these aren't people that they're like, yeah, fuck them. I don't ever want to be around them again.
Yeah,
right?
That's so true.
They're complicated relationships with friends, parents, family members, where it would hurt just as much to be far away from them and never speak to them, but it hurts a lot being this close to them too. So we have to do more of the like hard work of like, okay, now we're in this middle, like discerning. It's so much easier to be like, it's this is the boundary and I'm done.
Yeah.
Because then you never have to think or feel about it again. But that's not really how we have relationships in our life. They're like these multi-layered things. Yeah. Human beings are these multi-layered things. Yeah. And so I try to remember that when with this person in my life, they're engaging in a piece of them that it's not my favorite part of them. Yeah. That's like really into these spiritual topics and we really disagree. And there's a lot of black and white thinking on their end. But I try to remind myself of why I'm still in relationship with them, of what parts of them I really do love and respect, and how do I get the conversation more to that place to promote love. Yes. And to stay away from this place that really impedes love for me.
I am obsessed with that because you see all of these TikTok creators even nowadays. If someone's crossing a boundary, cut them off. But you're so right. A lot of the time, when you want to set a boundary with someone, it's because you do have a lot of love there. It's someone you respect. It's someone that's probably been in your life for a long time. It might be a family member, for example, that you just can't cut off because you're going to see them around the holidays and things around that. So I love the idea of trying to find not necessarily a middle ground, because in that situation you said, I'm just not going to engage with this conversation, but finding again the reasons that you love this person, why you want them to be in your life, and focusing on that rather than the negative and why they're really pissing you off in the moment of that too.
And both can exist.
Yes.
Like we can acknowledge this is really pissing me off and I'm having feelings about it because I've talked to you about it. And sometimes conflict is necessary in those moments. But in general, if you're talking about a relationship where it's ongoing and you're trying to make the best of it, you really do have to focus on the like, why am I still here?
You mentioned like an intellectual boundary just now and kind of like, you know, these beliefs that you have and this person has. And then there's emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, sexual boundaries, even like financial and time. What do you feel like in terms of those, the few examples I just mentioned might be the hardest boundary for people to actually set? I feel like a lot of the time people talk about boundaries really within the emotional lens of, this is how I feel about something, you're making me uncomfortable, or hey, we are just disagreeing on these two totally different concepts. But I think people do forget a lot of the time about the other areas of where people might struggle to set those boundaries. What do you think the most common boundaries setting, or like the most common theme around those boundaries might be the hardest to set in terms of some of those examples of boundaries I just mentioned?
Yeah. It varies a lot. Like the first place my brain goes is, obviously we're talking about something entirely different if there's endangerment to a person and needing to actually set a distancing physical boundary with someone. That's something entirely different. Right. And that does usually require immediate action in a sense, because you're not going to be able to set any kind of boundary, financial, sexual, emotional, if you don't feel physically safe.
Exactly.
Right. Like we're not going to set boundaries verbally with somebody who is a danger or a threat to you, right? So that changes the list of priorities entirely, right? Or it's like, or even not even physically, right? Like let's say it's with a parent and you're an underage person still living with your parents, right? And there's this level of financial dependence still on them. That's not immediately solvable, right? Like you're not going to immediately at 17, let's say, be able to go out, get a job that sustains you fully and move out
full
tomorrow.
House apartment.
Exactly. So I think those are often the most complicated place to set boundaries when there is a level of dependence on the person for something. That can happen in like more traditional like husband-wife relationships too, where if he's the main provider and you don't have a job, right? Or you've been at home with children for years, right? And there's things happening that you're not okay with. Again, that's very case by case, but that comes up to me immediately as one of the more difficult places to set boundaries. Not that we can't, but there are very real consequences to you setting boundaries too. You don't have the privilege of your own separate finances, your own separate space to go back to when you're feeling overwhelmed. You're there. You're in the space that's like triggering you. You're in the space that maybe is not safe for you. So that kind of sticks out as that first place when there's any sort of dependence, financial or provisional or even physical on a person.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That has to be handled with a lot of care.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to sort of do our boundaries in small bits, like in this gradual way.
You mentioned gradual. I want to hear about that more because people, I think a lot of the time just think setting boundary, your behavior better change immediately for it, cut off or distancing or whatever that looks like after. But I like this idea of them being more gradual and giving the other person a little more grace and time without it getting to a point where they're disrespecting you or disrespecting yourself, whatever that looks like. I want to talk about that gradual process more too.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a few exceptions, but I would say in general, when we're at a place where you're setting boundaries like, okay, no, I'm done with this. I'm no longer going to engage. Like, and there's a high level of emotion and reactivity.
Yeah.
What I can almost always predict is that that's been building for a long time.
So true.
That dynamic. And you've been saying, that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That bothers me, but it's all good. Right. Maybe it's some of the people pleasing we're engaging in for some people. It's like, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Until it reaches this point where you're like, I can't. There's nowhere else for me to go. I'm done.
Yeah.
And my best piece of advice is to avoid us getting to that place because it's really hard when you're in an emotionally reactive place to set moderate, thoughtful, mindful boundaries because you're in survival state at that point. You're in probably fight or flight. One of the two.
Yes.
Right? So you can't really engage at that moment neurologically in a way that is thoughtful, gradual. Let's see how you respond. Let's check in with myself. You just don't have it neurologically in that point. And that's
out
fine.
The window, literally. Yes.
Right. So my best piece of advice, honestly, is we try to not get there.
Yeah.
Which means we have to set smaller boundaries along the way, which means you have to validate your experiences that you're having, right? There's none of this like, it's okay. Right? Like it's fine. Like over and over
They've
and
done
over.
that like 10 times this month, but it's all good.
Yeah. Like all the boundary setting that is proactive is reliant upon your ability to scan, assess without judgment your own emotions towards things.
Yes.
And say, that did bother me a little bit. Right? Or, ooh, I didn't really enjoy what just happened. Right? How do I make space to like be curious and explore that for myself? And what do I want to do just slightly different next time to take care of myself? And again, to preserve the love I still have for this person. That's the other thing too, is if you let them build and build and build, it's so ironic because you're doing it in the name of people pleasing. Like, well, I don't want to start a fight and like, I don't want them to get mad. But what you're doing is you're getting mad.
Yeah.
You're getting upset.
You're fuming every time they speak. You're like,
yes.
eye twitching.
Yes. You're feeling more and more resentment towards them, which is damaging your relationship. It's just internal rather than external.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
spot on.
I think if we recognize that like damage is occurring, whether you confront this issue or not, it can help us maybe gain a little bit of the bravery that's required to confront the thing if needed, or just confront it within yourself and say, I'm going to need to put some internal boundaries in place for this.
Yes.
Right. And sometimes they don't need to be spoken to the other person. Sometimes they just need to be for you of like, I know that I'm not going to engage in this topic anymore. Right. Or I know that I'm not going to meet in this specific setting anymore. I always say I recommend sharing what your boundaries are explicitly with people so that people aren't like wondering what's happening.
Yeah.
Getting
They're
confused.
like, why are you so mad right now? And they have no idea because you haven't communicated that either. Yeah,
yes,
definitely.
But when you're setting, again, those more proactive, smaller, more moderate boundaries, sometimes they're just between you and you.
I like that.
Of like, okay, this is not a huge problem right now, but it doesn't need to be a huge problem for me to address it. Right? I'm trying to preserve love, which means I need to kind of be aware of threats to love. So I'm going to do some internal monitoring and maybe set those boundaries in a smaller way.
Yes.
And then again, I'm seeing how they respond to me making those changes. And I'm taking it in as it comes, right? So maybe they'll surprise you and they adjust well.
Yeah.
Right? And then love is supported. Where you're like, oh, amazing. They like really rocked with this change.
Yes.
Like,
And then that's like the best feeling ever because you're proud of yourself for saying something. And then it honestly can bring you very much closer to someone too when you said something that you have all this anxiety about and then that person's like, dude, I can absolutely do that. That's not a big deal. Didn't even realize I was doing that. There can be quick change there too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, there are exceptions to this statement I'm about to say too, but in general, I like to say give people room to surprise you.
I love that.
Just give them room because we really like to think we know what they're going to do at every turn.
You like I'm the person that if I'm having a disagreement with a friend or just anxious about something that someone's done, that I will be the person in the shower having this full argument that then I actually approach them and like, hey, this really hurt my feelings. Like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And I'm like, well, I just practiced for 2 hours.
Said, I was ready for you to say
I had all of these follow-ups. So thank you for that. But no, I love that. Give people room to surprise you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Outside of, you mentioned obviously people pleasers, and I'm a fellow people pleaser, so I understand, might be a type of person that struggles with boundaries. What type of other personality traits do you feel like align with someone who struggles with setting boundaries? Even maybe an extrovert who values their energy and time with people, and the fear of being rejected from a group or a person might really scare them from setting a boundary, because that's how they get their energy and that's how they feel the most themselves. What other personality traits have you may have noticed of people, or even with family upbringing too, maybe how they were raised and what that personality of their parents look like with setting boundaries or something? What can that kind of look like in terms of someone who may struggle with setting boundaries?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think honestly, the through line, because there's a lot of different traits that can be personified, but the through line is if someone does not have a strong sense of self. So that could be the extrovert, like party goer. That could be the super shy and reserved person. There's not set traits for that, but it's if you lack a centered, grounded sense of self, right? Because what happens is if you don't, it's really easy to kind of come into this, what I would call what's called enmeshment with another person, where it's very hard to distinguish whose feelings are whose and like what they want versus what I want. And it's very hard to distinguish between the two people or however many people are in this group. And you have to be able to do that in order to set boundaries. You have to be able to distinguish, where does this person end? And where do I begin, so that I don't start taking responsibility for their feelings and what's going on in their life and trying to mitigate disappointment for them. That's a big thing, especially for people pleasers. It's like, I don't want to disappoint someone else.
Exactly.
I don't want them to get mad at me. Right. And the same can be true if it's more internally motivated, where it's like, oh, I don't want to miss an opportunity. And like, I don't want to like be looked over for things. Like I have to say yes and yes and yes to everything. Right. If you have a strong sense of self, you can understand where kind of the ceiling is for that. Like, where's the cap for that? Where's the difference between, okay, I'm extending myself because I have a goal. I don't necessarily want to do this thing, but I see the end result of it in a way versus a fear place of like, if this doesn't happen, or if I don't say yes, then I don't know who I'll be. I don't know how I'll define myself, right? When there's so much identity attached to every yes that you're saying to something that you don't want to say yes to.
Oh, that's such a good point. I feel like I did that for so much in my life too. You mentioned earlier just saying no to plans and just saying yes to everything, things that you don't even align with yourself and who you like. And people, even maybe it's like bad behavior that you just kind of go along with because of that. And I feel like I really did struggle with like a sense of self for so long too. So I love that. My last question for you too, before we give general advice, because we're out of time almost. I can't believe that went so fast. How can people look out for someone who may be setting boundaries within a manipulative tactic and a manipulative standpoint? I think a lot of the time setting boundaries, like we mentioned, is for yourself and requests and giving people, time to surprise you. But a lot of the time people might use setting boundaries as a way to control someone. And so how can people look out for that? And what might be some other examples of manipulative behavior in terms of setting boundaries too?
Yeah. That's a spicy topic, because I feel like that is happening a lot in kind of like social media examples that I see. I feel like if there is no room for dialogue around the boundary, that could be a sign of manipulation. Again, these aren't black and white rules. There's so much that's case by case. But if the boundary is always it's this or that, or it's a yes or a no, right? And there's no room for the other person's experience or feelings or perspective on something, that can be a big sign of I'm trying to get a specific outcome. And I'm not open to, again, the collaboration that's needed in the relationship aspect. I don't mean collaboration in terms of they have to okay your boundary, because they don't. A lot of people won't like the boundaries you're setting.
True.
But again, the idea that I'm kind of setting out and saying this is what it is, and there's no room to even hear your perspective or how that might impact you. And to, again, practice that as that's how I help preserve the love in this relationship. I'm doing something hard.
Yeah.
I'm maybe removing access to myself in a way that you've been used to having access to me in this way.
Yeah.
And I have some empathy for how that might impact you without changing my mind. Like we're holding both, right?
Yeah.
Of like, I understand that could be a really hard change for you because now I'm saying no to something that I've said yes to. Like the friend in the example of like, I understand you might have feelings about like getting upset that I'm saying no.
Yeah.
When
After I'm like out with you every single Thursday
when
night.
you're used to me being with you every single night.
Yeah.
And I'm open to hearing your feelings about it. And I'm open to talking about those without compromising on my boundary.
Yes. I love that advice. Because it is really easy when you set a boundary with someone, if they disagree to do something, okay, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I'll continue to do that. And then it's really important that you stick with when your gut, what your mind's telling you, what your body's telling you in a lot of these situations too, because you probably sometimes can feel when a boundary has been overstepped before you even process in your mind that, man, this is something that I don't like. So
100%.
I love that, sticking to your guns. Brooke, last words of advice for this person struggling with setting a boundary. What would you like to tell them in terms of just dealing with this friend who, again, they might just be expecting them the worst from them setting this boundary. Obviously, this friend gets a little upset when other people say no to them. So that is a possibility. But what advice would you have for this person in communicating to their friend what they need so that their grades aren't slipping and that they just honestly, at the end of the day, have a better relationship with this person too?
Yeah.
If that's something that they want.
Yeah. In terms of the actual approach for kind of a boundary conversation, my preferred place to start is just with the facts, like with what I'm observing about myself. So in this case, I have been saying yes to these plans for weeks and I'm noticing I'm exhausted. And I'm noticing that like school is slipping as a priority or like, or I can't keep up with my grades. And the thing I'd have you notice and talk about the most is how it's impacting you, right? That's a great preceder for a boundary.
That's great advice.
Right? As opposed to like, hey, you're really messing me up because you won't let me say no, right? And like
the you statements.
You're immediately going to get a more spicy response from anyone if you start coming out hot in a blame manner. So that's kind of, it's an answer to your last question too, and this one of like, how do you look out for manipulation as well? If people continuously start their boundary conversations with being like, here's everything you're doing wrong. Right? And there's no ownership over their part they've played in not keeping their own boundaries.
Right.
That would always be a sign to me of something a little bit more manipulative or something that's a little bit more immature in the boundary setting sense, or like an emotional immaturity. If you can't recognize the part I played in not saying no when I wanted to say no and I didn't, right? Like there's two parts to that. But if I can't say, I did that. I did that too. That's always a marker to me of like, something to watch.
Good.
And so that's what I would say for this person too, is start with what you're observing about yourself. Like how is the boundary crossing and violating that you've been doing impacting you as a person?
Yes.
And then share your feelings about that, right? Sharing like, hey, when this happens, I don't feel as excited to go out with you the next night because I'm so tired, because I'm thinking about school. So I'm thinking I'm going to have to cut back on the nights I go out with you, or I'm going to have to just be really thoughtful about when I say yes versus no.
Love that.
Because again, thinking of preserving love, it's making me not enjoy the time as much because I'm so distracted and so tired with other things.
Because I just got an F on my math calculus test. Like, how am I supposed to like take a shot with you? It's not gonna happen.
Yeah. And throughout this, again, taking your deep breaths, checking in with how you're feeling while you're talking, right? Like appearing confident, like don't come in apologetic with your boundaries, and then give space for the other person to talk to you about it, about how it impacts you. Again, maybe there's some room to negotiate the boundary, but maybe there's not. Maybe there's, no, this is what it is. And I make space for your feelings 100%. And I'm happy to talk to you about them. I'm happy to call you on the phone and say like, here's why I'm saying no, right? But I'm still saying no.
Still happening.
It's still happening and I still love you. And here's how I'm making space for you to have feelings about it too.
Yeah. That is such great advice, Brooke. Honestly, everything you just said, I'm like taking note for myself because I feel like I've been setting boundaries not in the best way, honestly, based on our conversation today. So thank you so much for joining and offering all of your expertise on this topic. I'm going to allow you some time to plug your business, social media, everything so people know where to find you on all of your platforms too.
Yes. Okay. So on Instagram, I am _the more life. And then TikTok, it is spicy counselor.
Love it. Spicy counselor.
Spicy counselor. Yes. We talk about sex. We talk about religion. We talk about relationships. We talk about boundary setting, all of it. So.
I love it. You guys know where to find Brooke. Hit her up on all of social media and everything. And if you, I guess, are you accepting new clients too at this time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I just had a couple spots open up.
Love
and
it.
so I am accepting new clients. I'm super excited. If it feels like that would be a fit, then yeah.
You guys know where to find her. I'll put all of her information on our episode bio description to find. But as always, if you guys have any other topics that you want advice on, head to my Instagram or TikTok at Unlicensed Advice. Fill out that Google form. Again, we have wonderful guests like Brooke joining us each and every week. So I love you guys and I'll see you next week.